The jungle canopy above filtered the alien sun into shifting patterns of emerald and gold, but Toby's sharp hazel eyes weren't admiring the scenery. He crouched motionless behind a massive root system, his scarred hands gripping the salvaged plasma rifle with practiced ease. The three Skarath scouts moved through the undergrowth ahead, their quadrupedal forms rippling with predatory grace, bony plates gleaming like natural armor. They thought they were hunting him. The irony wasn't lost on Toby as his crooked grin flashed briefly across his weathered face. The lead Skarath paused, its serpentine head swiveling as it tasted the air. Red eyes swept the jungle, searching for the human prey that had been reported in this sector. Toby's grin widened. Let them look. He'd learned to hunt in Earth's wildlands before the colony ships launched, tracking deer through Michigan forests while wolves still prowled the deeper woods. The predators of home had taught him patience, cunning, and the art of becoming invisible. These alien killers, for all their natural weapons and pack instincts, had never faced prey that could think 3 moves ahead. The scout's tail lashed impatiently, a tell Toby had cataloged weeks ago. When the Skarath grew frustrated, they made mistakes. He shifted his weight silently, muscles coiled like springs. The forest had taught him to move like shadow, to strike like lightning. The moment came as the lead scout turned away. Toby exploded from cover, his lean frame uncoiling with predatory speed. The plasma bolt took the creature center mass, its agonized shriek echoing through the canopy as it collapsed in a tangle of limbs and smoking flesh. The other two wheeled toward him, snarling fury in their guttural language, but Toby was already moving. He rolled behind a fallen log as claws raked the air where he'd been standing, then came up firing. One scout stumbled, ichor streaming from its flank, while the third circled wide, trying to flank him. "Come on, then," Toby muttered, his hazel eyes tracking both wounded predators. His shoulders hunched slightly, the weight of leadership bearing down even in combat. Every colonist who didn't come home was on him, but right now, in this moment, he was what his species had always been, apex predator. The wounded scout charged first, pain making it reckless. Toby sidestepped with fluid grace, letting momentum carry the creature past him before putting a plasma bolt through its skull. The third scout, seeing its packmates dead, made the mistake of hesitating. Humans didn't hesitate, not when survival was on the line. Toby's final shot dropped the last scout before it could retreat. 3 bodies lay cooling in the alien jungle, their red eyes dimming to black. He approached each corpse carefully, checking for signs of life with the caution of a predator who'd learned never to assume the hunt was over. Back at the colony, Candace looked up from her work as Toby emerged from the tree line. Her auburn hair was escaping its practical knot, and her green eyes held that familiar glint of focused determination. She'd been reinforcing the perimeter wall with salvaged hull plates, her calloused hands steady despite the sweat beading on her freckled brow. 3 scouts, Toby reported, his restless energy evident in the way he shifted from foot to foot. They're probing our defenses, testing response times. Candace's fingers tapped against her thigh, her thinking rhythm. That's the 2nd patrol this week. They're getting bolder. Her jaw clenched slightly, a sign of the frustration she kept carefully controlled. Or more desperate. Maybe both. Toby's grin faded to a tight line as he studied the improvised fortifications. Salvaged ship parts, scavenged alien tech, and human ingenuity formed a barrier that looked pathetic compared to the vast jungle beyond. But it was theirs, and they'd make it hold. The eastern section needs work, Candace continued, gesturing toward a gap in the wall where her latest addition was still cooling. I can have it sealed by tomorrow if the fabricator holds out. Toby nodded, his hazel eyes already scanning for the next threat. Leadership meant seeing 3 moves ahead, just like hunting. The Skarath would come again, in greater numbers. They'd test the walls, probe for weaknesses, search for the easiest way to reach the soft human prey inside. But as he watched Candace work, her steady hands turning scrap into salvation, Toby felt his confidence return. The Skarath thought they were hunting prey. They were about to learn that sometimes prey had teeth. The colonist medic approached from the direction of the medical bay, their wiry frame moving with the careful gait of someone favoring an old injury. Gray hair caught the fading light as they rubbed their neck, a gesture Toby recognized as stress made manifest. "Any wounded from your little hunting trip?" the medic asked, brown eyes tired but alert. "Just me," Toby replied, flexing his scarred hands, "and 3 dead Skarath." The medic's rare smile flickered across their worn features. "Good, we can't afford to lose anyone else." The smile faded as quickly as it had come, but they'll be back. They always come back. "Let them," Candace said without looking up from her work. Her green eyes caught the last rays of sunlight, determination burning bright. "This time we'll be ready." As the alien sun set behind the jungle canopy, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, the colony settled into its nightly routine. Guards took their positions, families gathered in the communal spaces, and the soft hum of Candace's jury-rigged systems provided a technological lullaby. But in the darkness beyond the walls, Red Eyes watched and waited. The Skarath were patient hunters, evolved predators who had ruled this world for millennia. They would return, and when they did, they would bring the full fury of their kind. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that humans had been forged in the crucible of a world filled with predators. They had learned to survive by becoming the thing their enemies feared most. The hunt was just beginning. The attack came at midnight when the colony's defenses were thinnest and hope burned lowest. Candace had been expecting it. Her green eyes had barely closed when the perimeter alarms shrieked their electronic warning across the settlement. She rolled from her cot, calloused hands already reaching for the control pad that would activate her latest creation. "Toby," she called, her voice cutting through the chaos as colonists stumbled from their shelters. "Eastern perimeter now." The Skarath moved like liquid shadow through the darkness, their red eyes cutting crimson trails through the night. A dozen of them, maybe more, flowing around the colony's walls with the coordinated grace of a pack that had perfected the art of night hunting. Their guttural snarls rose above the screaming alarms, a sound that sent ice through human veins. Toby appeared at her side, plasma rifle in hand, his weathered face grim in the emergency lighting. His hazel eyes tracked the moving shadows beyond the walls, calculating angles and distances with the precision of a born hunter. "How many?" 15, maybe 20. Candace's fingers flew over the control interface, her tapping rhythm accelerated by adrenaline. "They're trying to punch through the eastern wall where we're weakest." The lead Skarath struck first, its massive form crashing against the hastily reinforced barrier. Hull plates groaned under the impact, and somewhere in the darkness, a colonist screamed. The sound seemed to energize the pack, their snarls rising to a fever pitch as more of them threw themselves against the defenses. "They're coordinated," Toby muttered, his crooked grin absent for once. "This isn't a raid, it's a siege." Candace's jaw clenched as another impact shook the eastern wall. Her electromagnetic trap was nearly ready, capacitors charging with a rising whine that made her teeth ache. But she needed 30 more seconds, and the walls might not last that long. "Buy me time," she said, her green eyes meeting his hazel ones. No explanations needed. They'd been through this dance before. Toby nodded and sprinted toward the eastern perimeter, his lean frame moving with predatory speed. He reached the wall just as the first Skarath managed to tear a gap in the hull plating. The creature's red eyes locked onto him, and for a moment, predator faced predator across the darkness. The Skarath lunged, claws extended, expecting easy prey. Instead, it found a human who'd learned to fight from watching wolves, patient, calculating, utterly ruthless. Toby's plasma rifle barked once, twice, and the creature collapsed in a tangle of smoking flesh and spilled ichor. But there were more behind it, always more, pressing through the gap with relentless hunger. Toby fell back, drawing them away from the breach, his scarred hands steady on the rifle despite the impossible odds. This was what leadership meant, standing between his people and the dark. "Come on, Candace," he whispered, squeezing off another shot. "Whatever you're cooking up, now would be good." The electromagnetic pulse hit like a thunderclap, washing over the eastern perimeter in a wave of crackling energy. The attacking Skarath froze mid-charge, their nervous systems overloaded by the sudden electromagnetic storm. They convulsed once, twice, then collapsed in twitching heaps, their red eyes dimming to black. Silence fell over the colony like a blanket, broken only by the soft crackling of discharged energy and the ragged breathing of terrified colonists. Toby lowered his rifle, his hazel eyes wide with something approaching awe. "Electromagnetic pulse generator," Candace called from her position at the control station, her voice steady despite the sweat beading on her freckled face. "Jury-rigged from the old mining equipment, overloads their neural pathways." The colonist medic appeared at the breach, their tired brown eyes surveying the aftermath. "Anyone hurt?" "A few cuts and bruises," Toby replied, but his attention was focused on the fallen Skarath. Something about their positioning bothered him. Too organized, too coordinated for a simple hunting pack. "Candace, look at this." She joined him at the breach, her auburn hair finally escaping its knot entirely. Her analytical mind was already working, green eyes cataloging details others might miss. "They attacked in formation. See how they spread along the wall? They were trying to create multiple breach points simultaneously." "That's not pack hunting behavior," Toby said grimly. "That's military tactics." The implications hit them both at the same time. The Skarath weren't just predators, they were organized, intelligent, and learning from each encounter. The electromagnetic pulse had worked this time, but they'd adapt, find counters, come back stronger. "We need to tell the others," the medic said, rubbing their neck in that familiar gesture of stress. "If they're getting smarter—" "They're not getting smarter," Candace interrupted, her jaw tightening with realization. "They were always this smart. They've just been testing us, learning our capabilities." Toby's crooked grin finally returned, but it held no warmth. "Then it's time they learned ours." As dawn broke over the alien landscape, the colonists gathered in the central square to survey the aftermath. The electromagnetic pulse had left scorch marks on the walls and the acrid smell of ozone in the air, but it had also left something else: hope. 15 dead Skarath, Toby announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the confidence of a leader who'd just proven his people weren't helpless prey. 0 human casualties. A cheer went up from the colonists, tired voices raised in defiant celebration. For the first time since the siege began, they felt like they might actually survive this. But Candace wasn't celebrating. Her green eyes were fixed on the tree line beyond the colony, where movement in the shadows suggested they were being watched. The Skarath were learning, adapting, preparing for the next phase of their assault. "This was just the beginning," she murmured to Toby, her fingers tapping against her thigh in that rapid rhythm that meant her mind was racing. "They'll be back." "Let them come," Toby replied, his scarred hands already planning the next defensive improvement. "We're not the same species that used to cower in caves, waiting for the predators to find us." The medic approached, a slight spring in their step that hadn't been there in weeks. "That pulse weapon of yours? Can you build more?" Candace's rare smile flickered across her features. "I can build better." In the distance, red eyes watched from the jungle's depths, and alien minds processed the night's events with cold calculation. The humans had shown new capabilities, new weapons, new tactics. The prey was evolving. But evolution was a game the Skarath had been playing for millennia, and they were far from finished. The Skarath outpost sat like a cancer in the clearing, 15 kilometers north of the colony. Through his scope, Toby counted at least 30 of the creatures moving between the crude structures they'd erected from fused stone and organic secretions. Their red eyes swept the perimeter constantly, but they were watching for threats that moved like prey. Skittish, predictable, afraid. They weren't watching for humans who moved like apex predators. "Thermal imaging shows the main concentration here," Candace whispered, her green eyes fixed on the portable scanner she'd jury-rigged from medical equipment. Her auburn hair was braided tight against her skull, and her face was streaked with the mud they'd used for camouflage. "Looks like some kind of command structure." Toby nodded, his weathered face grim in the pre-dawn darkness. He'd brought only 5 volunteers, the colony's best hunters and fighters, each one tested in the crucible of survival. The medic had argued against the mission, brown eyes dim with worry, but Toby knew the truth that lurked beneath their fear. Sometimes the best defense was a good offense. "Remember," he said to his team, his voice barely above a whisper, We're not here to fight them all. Hit hard, hit fast, and get out. Make them understand that their safe spaces aren't safe anymore. The assault began at dawn, when the Skarath were changing guard shifts and their attention was divided. Toby's team struck from 4 directions simultaneously, plasma rifles carving through the morning air with surgical precision. The first 3 Skarath died before they could even snarl a warning. But the pack responded with terrifying speed, their coordinated movements betraying the intelligence Candace had identified. They flowed toward the human positions like water finding the lowest ground, red eyes blazing with fury and calculation. "Time to go," Toby called, his crooked grin flashing as he squeezed off a final shot. "Phase 2, people." The retreat was the most dangerous part of the plan. The Skarath were natural pursuit predators, built for running down fleeing prey across vast distances. But humans had been persistence hunters too, back on Earth's ancient plains. They'd learned to turn the chase into a weapon. Toby's team split up, taking different routes through the jungle while maintaining comm contact. The pursuing Skarath, faced with multiple trails, divided their forces, exactly as Toby had hoped. What had been a coordinated pack became scattered hunting parties, each one outnumbered by the terrain and the humans' superior knowledge of the local geography. "Contact southeast quadrant," came the voice of Martin, one of the colony's former security guards. 3 bogies closing fast." "Lead them to checkpoint Alpha," Toby responded, his own pursuers crashing through the undergrowth behind him. "Remember, we're not running from them, we're leading them." The chase continued for hours, the Skarath's initial fury gradually giving way to confusion and then to something approaching respect. These humans weren't behaving like prey. They maintained their spacing, coordinated their movements, and turned every natural obstacle into a potential ambush point. By noon, the alien sun beating down through the canopy, the Skarath began to fall back. Their quadrupedal forms, built for short bursts of devastating speed, weren't designed for the kind of marathon pursuit that humans had perfected over millions of years of evolution. "They're breaking off," reported David, the colony's chief of agriculture, her voice slightly breathless but triumphant. "All pursuit groups withdrawing to the northwest." Toby allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as he watched the last of his pursuers disappear into the jungle. His scarred hands were steady on his rifle, his hazel eyes tracking movement with predatory precision. The message had been sent. Humans weren't just prey cowering behind walls anymore. "Rendezvous at Checkpoint Delta," he ordered. "Then we head home." But as his team regrouped, Candace's voice crackled over the comm with an edge of excitement and worry. "Toby, you need to see this. I've been monitoring their communications during the raid, and I'm picking up something strange." "Strange how?" he asked, already jogging toward the rendezvous point. "They're not just talking to each other," she replied, her words rapid with the kind of discovery that made her green eyes light up. "They're transmitting to someone else, someone with much more sophisticated equipment." The implications hit Toby like a physical blow. The Skarath weren't operating alone. They had backing, support, possibly even direction from an outside source. The siege of the colony wasn't just about territory or hunting rights. It was part of something bigger. Back at the colony, the returning strike team was greeted with cautious celebration. The medic checked each member for injuries, their tired brown eyes brightening slightly at finding only minor cuts and bruises. But the real prize was the intelligence they'd gathered and the psychological impact on both sides. "They hesitated," reported Martin, his voice still carrying traces of adrenaline. "When we split up, they didn't know which group to follow. For maybe 30 seconds, they just stood there, confused." "That's not pack behavior," David added, stripping off her muddy gear. "Real predators don't hesitate like that. They adapt, improvise, follow their instincts." Toby nodded, his restless energy evident in the way he paced the debriefing room. "They're being controlled, directed. Someone's telling them how to hunt us." Candace looked up from her portable scanner, her face grave. "The signals I intercepted, they're not random. There's a pattern, almost like a code. Someone's coordinating their attacks, maybe even their entire strategy." The colony's leadership, such as it was, gathered around the central table as Candace projected her findings. The signal patterns were complex, sophisticated, clearly the product of technology far beyond what the Skarath possessed naturally. "So we're not just fighting animals," the medic said quietly, their hand rubbing their neck in that familiar gesture of stress. "We're fighting a proxy war." "Against who?" asked Martin. Toby's crooked grin was sharp as a blade. "Does it matter? Whoever they are, they picked the wrong species to mess with." His hazel eyes swept the assembled faces, seeing the mix of fear and determination that had carried them this far. Humans didn't climb to the top of Earth's food chain by rolling over for bullies. Outside the colony walls, the jungle was strangely quiet. The usual cacophony of alien wildlife had faded to whispers, as if the very ecosystem was holding its breath. But in the depths of the forest, red eyes watched and waited, while alien minds processed new data and adjusted their strategies. The humans had shown new capabilities today: coordination, endurance, tactical thinking. The prey was adapting faster than anticipated. Perhaps it was time to escalate the conflict, to bring in resources that would crush this unexpected resistance before it could spread. But as the Skarath prepared their next assault, they failed to notice the small device Candace had secreted near their outpost during the raid. A passive receiver, nearly undetectable, designed to intercept and record their communications. The hunt was no longer one-sided, and the humans were learning to be very good predators indeed. The assault came at dawn, and it was unlike anything the Skarath had attempted before. Wave after wave of the creatures threw themselves against the colony's defenses, their red eyes blazing with desperate fury. But this wasn't the chaotic rush of maddened beasts. It was a coordinated military operation that spoke of careful planning and outside direction. Candace watched from the command post as her electromagnetic pulse generators fired in sequence, each one sending cascading waves of energy across the killing field. The first wave of Skarath convulsed and fell, their nervous systems overloaded by the artificial lightning. But the second wave kept coming, their bodies somehow shielded against the pulse. "They adapted," she said grimly, her green eyes reflecting the crackling energy outside. Her fingers tapped rapidly against the control console, thinking rhythm accelerated by adrenaline and fear. "They're wearing some kind of insulation." Toby's scarred hands gripped his plasma rifle as he coordinated the defense from the eastern wall. His hazel eyes tracked the advancing enemy with predatory precision, noting the subtle changes in their attack patterns. These weren't the same creatures they'd been fighting for weeks. Someone had been teaching them. "Fall back to secondary positions," he ordered over the comm. "Let them take the outer perimeter." The colonist medic looked up from their makeshift aid station, brown eyes wide with alarm. "We're abandoning the walls?" "We're drawing them in," Toby replied, his crooked grin flashing despite the desperate situation. "Candace, tell me you've got something nasty waiting for them." "Working on it," she called back, her steady hands making final adjustments to a device that looked like it had been cobbled together from mining equipment and medical scanners. "I need 2 more minutes." 2 minutes felt like an eternity as the Skarath poured through the breached outer wall. Their coordinated advance was a thing of terrible beauty, each creature moving with purpose, covering their packmates' flanks, exploiting every weakness in the human defensive line. This was warfare, not hunting. The lead elements reached the inner compound just as Candace's device came online. The sonic pulse that erupted from the modified speakers was inaudible to human ears, but the effect on the Skarath was immediate and devastating. They stumbled, claws scraping uselessly at their heads as the frequency disrupted their inner ear balance. "Subsonic disruptor," Candace explained, her voice tight with concentration, "attacks their vestibular system. They can't coordinate if they can't stand up straight." But even as the first wave collapsed in confusion, more Skarath kept coming. They adapted again, covering their audio receptors, moving in short rushes that minimized their exposure to the sonic assault. Someone was teaching them to overcome human ingenuity in real time. That's when they brought in the prisoner. The capture happened during a brief lull in the fighting. 3 Skarath had become separated from their pack during one of Candace's sonic pulses, and Toby's team had managed to isolate and subdue one of them. The creature now sat in the colony's makeshift holding cell, its red eyes burning with alien intelligence and something that might have been contempt. "It's not trying to escape," observed the medic, their tired voice carrying notes of unease. "Most animals in captivity show signs of stress, fear, desperation. This one just watches." The Skarath's gaze followed each human that passed its cell, head tilting slightly as it cataloged their movements, their weaknesses, their routines. When Toby approached for interrogation, the creature's scarred maw split in what might have been a smile. "You fight well for prey," it said in heavily accented standard, the words emerging as a guttural rasp that sent chills down human spines. Toby's hazel eyes narrowed. "You speak our language." "We learn quickly. It is necessary." The Skarath's red eyes seemed to bore into him. "You are not like the others we have hunted. You adapt. You surprise us." "Who's giving you orders?" Toby demanded, his scarred hands clenched into fists. "Who taught you to coordinate your attacks?" The creature's head tilted further, a gesture that was almost curious. "You assume we need teaching. Perhaps you underestimate what we have always been capable of." But there was something in its tone, a carefully neutral quality that suggested layers beneath the words. Candace, monitoring the interrogation from her station, felt her analytical mind catch on the inconsistencies. The Skarath's equipment was too advanced, their tactics too sophisticated, their adaptation too rapid. "It's lying," she said quietly to Toby over a private channel, "or at least not telling the whole truth. The signal intercepts I've been analyzing, they're definitely receiving external communications." The interrogation continued through the night as the siege entered a temporary lull. The Skarath forces had withdrawn beyond the tree line, but their red eyes still glowed in the darkness, watching and waiting. The prisoner answered some questions, deflected others, and seemed to take genuine interest in human responses to various scenarios. "Your species is fascinating," it said during one exchange, its voice carrying what might have been academic curiosity. "Most prey species focus only on flight when threatened. You have weaponized your fear." "We're not prey," Toby replied firmly. "No," the Skarath agreed, and for a moment its red eyes seemed almost thoughtful. "Perhaps that is the problem." By morning, the pattern had become clear. The siege wasn't just about conquering the colony, it was about studying human capabilities, testing their responses, gathering intelligence. The attacks were as much scientific experiment as military operation. "They're not trying to win," Candace realized as she reviewed the night's data. "They're trying to learn. Each attack is designed to force us to reveal new capabilities." The medic looked up from their patient notes, brown eyes reflecting growing understanding. "And someone's collecting that data." Toby's crooked grin was sharp as a blade as the pieces fell into place. The Skarath weren't the real enemy. They were tools, weapons aimed at humanity by some unseen hand. The colony was under siege not because they were a threat, but because they were a test case. "Time to give them something to really study," he said, his restless energy focused now on a new target. "Candace, how long would it take to modify your signal interceptor into a transmitter?" Her green eyes lit up with understanding. "You want to turn the tables, make them the ones being studied." "I want to find out who's really behind this," Toby replied, his hazel eyes hard as flint, "and then I want to have a conversation with them." Outside the colony walls, the Skarath prepared for another assault. But this time, they would find their prey had become something far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. The humans were no longer just defending, they were hunting. And the galaxy was about to learn what happened when humanity stopped running from predators and started becoming them. The revelation hit like a plasma bolt to the chest. Candace stared at the decoded transmissions, scrolling across her improvised display, her green eyes wide with a mixture of triumph and horror. After 3 days of painstaking work, she'd finally cracked the encryption on the Skarath communications, and what she found changed everything. "Toby," she called, her voice tight with urgency. "You need to see this now." He appeared at her workstation within seconds, his hazel eyes immediately focusing on the translated text. The medic and several other colonists gathered around, their faces reflecting the tension in Candace's voice. "Test subjects continue to demonstrate unexpected adaptation rates," Toby read aloud, his weathered face growing grimmer with each word. Recommend escalation to Phase 3 protocols. Human defensive capabilities exceed initial projections by 340%. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside the colony walls, the usual sounds of alien wildlife had resumed, but inside the compound, the weight of understanding settled over the survivors like a shroud. "We're not being hunted," the medic said quietly, their tired brown eyes reflecting dawning horror. "We're being studied." Candace's fingers tapped rapidly against her thigh as she pulled up additional intercepts. "It gets worse. Look at this." More text appeared on the screen, and her voice took on the clipped tone she used when delivering bad news. "The Skarath are reporting to something called the Hegemony Council. They've been ordered to test human combat evolution potential using graduated pressure scenarios. They're treating us like lab rats," said Martin, his voice rough with anger. "Not lab rats," Toby corrected, his crooked grin completely absent. "Lab rats don't fight back. We're more like a stress test. They want to see how far they can push us before we break." Candace brought up a new section of the intercepts, her auburn hair falling loose from its knot as she leaned forward. "This is the part that really scares me. They're not just testing our defensive capabilities, they're measuring our potential for offensive expansion. Listen to this. Species exhibits concerning predatory adaptation. Recommend immediate containment protocols before territorial expansion becomes viable." The implications crashed over the assembled colonists like a wave. The siege wasn't about conquest or resources, it was about fear. Somewhere in the galaxy, a power structure that called itself the Hegemony Council had looked at humanity and seen not prey, but a potential threat to their carefully maintained order. "They're afraid of us," Toby said, his voice carrying a note of savage satisfaction. "All this time we thought we were fighting for survival, but they're the ones who are scared." The medic rubbed their neck, that familiar gesture of stress now tinged with something else, a growing sense of vindication. "How many other colonies have they done this to? How many human settlements have been tested and found wanting?" Candace's green eyes reflected the glow of her screens as she scrolled through more data. "According to these logs, we're not the first. There have been at least 12 other experimental scenarios conducted on human colonies over the past 5 years. All of them ended in what the reports call acceptable containment parameters." "You mean they were all wiped out?" Martin said flatly. "All except one." Candace's voice held a note of grim hope as she highlighted a particular section. "New Geneva, in the Proxima Centauri system. The Skarath reported a test failure there 18 months ago. The colony not only survived, but launched a successful counteroffensive that drove the Skarath completely out of the system." Toby's hazel eyes lit up with predatory interest. "They fought back and won." "More than that," Candace continued, her analytical mind racing through the implications. "The Hegemony Council classified New Geneva as a priority containment target and ordered a full quarantine of the system. They're not just afraid of individual human colonies anymore, they're afraid of what happens when we start communicating with each other." The pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. Humanity's expansion into the galaxy hadn't been the peaceful colonization effort they'd believed. It had been a carefully monitored experiment, with colonies isolated and tested to determine the species' true potential. Most had failed the test and been eliminated. A few, like New Geneva, had passed and become targets for complete suppression. "So what's our play?" asked the medic, their brown eyes reflecting a hardness that hadn't been there weeks ago. "Do we try to contact New Geneva? Warn other colonies?" "We do more than that," Toby said, his restless energy now focused on a clear target. "We turn this whole operation inside out. If they want to study human predatory potential, let's give them a demonstration they'll never forget." Candace's rare smile flickered across her features as she began making modifications to her communication array. "I can boost the signal strength, punch through their jamming, but it'll take time and they'll detect the transmission attempts." "Then we better make sure they're too busy to interfere," Toby replied, his crooked grin returning with lethal intent. "How long do you need?" 6 hours to modify the equipment, another 2 to establish a clear channel to New Geneva and any other colonies in range. 8 hours. Toby's scarred hands moved to his weapon, checking the charge with practiced efficiency. "I can give you 8 hours." The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity. While Candace worked to establish communications with the wider human diaspora, Toby would lead every able-bodied colonist in a massive offensive against the Skarath positions. Not to destroy them, that was impossible with their current numbers, but to keep them so busy fighting for survival that they couldn't interfere with the transmission. "You're talking about betting everything on a single gamble," the medic warned, their voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many desperate plans fail. "No," Toby corrected, his hazel eyes hard as steel. "I'm talking about doing what humans have always done when someone tries to keep us in a cage. We bite our way out." As the colony prepared for what might be their final battle, the captured Skarath watched from its cell with something approaching approval. When Toby stopped by for one last interrogation, the creature's red eyes seemed almost amused. "You have finally understood," it said in its rasping voice, "the true nature of the hunt." "Which is?" "There is no prey. There are only predators who have not yet realized their strength." The Skarath's scarred maw split in that alien smile. "Your species is about to remember what it means to be apex." Outside the colony, the Skarath forces prepared for what they assumed would be another contained engagement. They had no idea that their carefully controlled experiment was about to become something far more dangerous, a declaration of war against the very concept of human containment. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when humanity stopped running from predators and started becoming them. The revelation hit like a plasma bolt to the chest. Candace stared at the decoded transmissions scrolling across her improvised display, her green eyes wide with a mixture of triumph and horror. After 3 days of painstaking work, she'd finally cracked the encryption on the Skarath communications, and what she found changed everything. "Toby," she called, her voice tight with urgency, "you need to see this now." He appeared at her workstation within seconds, his hazel eyes immediately focusing on the translated text. The medic and several other colonists gathered around, their faces reflecting the tension in Candace's voice. "Test subjects continue to demonstrate unexpected adaptation rates," Toby read aloud, his weathered face growing grimmer with each word. "Recommend escalation to Phase 3 protocols. Human defensive capabilities exceed initial projections by 340%. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside the colony walls, the usual sounds of alien wildlife had resumed, but inside the compound, the weight of understanding settled over the survivors like a shroud. "We're not being hunted," the medic said quietly, their tired brown eyes reflecting dawning horror. "We're being studied." Candace's fingers tapped rapidly against her thigh as she pulled up additional intercepts. "It gets worse. Look at this." More text appeared on the screen, and her voice took on the clipped tone she used when delivering bad news. "The Skarath are reporting to something called the Hegemony Council. They've been ordered to test human combat evolution potential using graduated pressure scenarios. They're treating us like lab rats," said Martin, his voice rough with anger. "Not lab rats," Toby corrected, his crooked grin completely absent. "Lab rats don't fight back. We're more like a stress test. They want to see how far they can push us before we break." Candace brought up a new section of the intercepts, her auburn hair falling loose from its knot as she leaned forward. "This is the part that really scares me. They're not just testing our defensive capabilities, they're measuring our potential for offensive expansion. Listen to this. Species exhibits concerning predatory adaptation. Recommend immediate containment protocols before territorial expansion becomes viable." The implications crashed over the assembled colonists like a wave. The siege wasn't about conquest or resources, it was about fear. Somewhere in the galaxy, a power structure that called itself the Hegemony Council had looked at humanity and seen not prey, but a potential threat to their carefully maintained order. "They're afraid of us," Toby said, his voice carrying a note of savage satisfaction. "All this time we thought we were fighting for survival, but they're the ones who are scared." The medic rubbed their neck, that familiar gesture of stress now tinged with something else, a growing sense of vindication. "How many other colonies have they done this to? How many human settlements have been tested and found wanting? Candace's green eyes reflected the glow of her screens as she scrolled through more data. According to these logs, we're not the first. There have been at least 12 other experimental scenarios conducted on human colonies over the past 5 years. All of them ended in what the reports call acceptable containment parameters. You mean they were all wiped out, Martin said flatly. All except one. Candace's voice held a note of grim hope as she highlighted a particular section. New Geneva in the Proxima Centauri system. The Skarath reported a test failure there 18 months ago. The colony not only survived but launched a successful counteroffensive that drove the Skarath completely out of the system. Toby's hazel eyes lit up with predatory interest. They fought back and won. More than that, Candace continued, her analytical mind racing through the implications. The Hegemony Council classified New Geneva as a priority containment target and ordered a full quarantine of the system. They're not just afraid of individual human colonies anymore. They're afraid of what happens when we start communicating with each other. The pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. Humanity's expansion into the galaxy hadn't been the peaceful colonization effort they'd believed. It had been a carefully monitored experiment, with colonies isolated and tested to determine the species' true potential. Most had failed the test and been eliminated. A few, like New Geneva, had passed and become targets for complete suppression. "So what's our play?" asked the medic, their brown eyes reflecting a hardness that hadn't been there weeks ago. "Do we try to contact New Geneva? Warn other colonies?" "We do more than that," Toby said, his restless energy now focused on a clear target. "We turn this whole operation inside out. If they want to study human predatory potential, let's give them a demonstration they'll never forget." Candace's rare smile flickered across her features as she began making modifications to her communication array. "I can boost the signal strength, punch through their jamming. But it'll take time, and they'll detect the transmission attempts. Then we better make sure they're too busy to interfere," Toby replied, his crooked grin returning with lethal intent. "How long do you need?" 6 hours to modify the equipment, another 2 to establish a clear channel to New Geneva and any other colonies in range. 8 hours. Toby's scarred hands moved to his weapon, checking the charge with practiced efficiency. "I can give you 8 hours." The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity. While Candace worked to establish communications with the wider human diaspora, Toby would lead every able-bodied colonist in a massive offensive against the Skarath positions. Not to destroy them, that was impossible with their current numbers, but to keep them so busy fighting for survival that they couldn't interfere with the transmission. "You're talking about betting everything on a single gamble," the medic warned, their voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many desperate plans fail. "No," Toby corrected, his hazel eyes hard as steel. "I'm talking about doing what humans have always done when someone tries to keep us in a cage. We bite our way out." As the colony prepared for what might be their final battle, the captured Skarath watched from its cell with something approaching approval. When Toby stopped by for one last interrogation, the creature's red eyes seemed almost amused. "You have finally understood," it said in its rasping voice, "the true nature of the hunt. Which is, there is no prey. There are only predators who have not yet realized their strength." The Skarath's scarred maw split in that alien smile. "Your species is about to remember what it means to be apex." Outside the colony, the Skarath forces prepared for what they assumed would be another contained engagement. They had no idea that their carefully controlled experiment was about to become something far more dangerous. A declaration of war against the very concept of human containment. The galaxy was about to be shaken to its core. The pre-dawn chill bit at Toby's exposed skin, but he barely noticed. His focus was absolute, honed by weeks of relentless pressure and the chilling revelation of their true predicament. Around him, the assembled colonists, no longer just farmers and engineers, but hardened survivors, moved with a grim determination. They were fewer than 100, armed with salvaged weapons and a desperate hope, facing an enemy that outnumbered them by orders of magnitude and was backed by an unseen, powerful force. Remember the objective. Toby's voice was a low growl carrying through the ranks. Keep them busy, keep them guessing. Candace needs time. Martin, his face streaked with camouflage paint, gripped his plasma rifle. We'll give her all the time she needs, Toby. David, the former agricultural chief, nodded beside him, her expression resolute. The plan was a symphony of misdirection and brute force. Small, highly mobile teams would hit the Skarath's known staging areas, not to hold ground, but to inflict maximum disruption and then fade back into the jungle, forcing the enemy to divide their attention. The main force, led by Toby, would launch a feint towards the largest Skarath encampment, drawing the bulk of their forces into a prolonged engagement. As the first alien sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the jungle in hues of deep purple and blood orange, Toby gave the signal. The colony erupted. Makeshift explosives crafted by Candace from mining charges detonated at strategic points around the Skarath perimeter, sending plumes of smoke and alien debris into the air. The cacophony was deafening, a human declaration of defiance. Toby's team moved like a single fluid entity, their plasma rifles spitting bolts of superheated energy. The Skarath, caught off guard by the sheer audacity of the human offensive, roared in confusion and fury. Their coordinated lines wavered as they tried to respond to attacks from multiple unexpected directions. "They're reacting to the feints!" Toby yelled over the din, a savage joy in his voice. This wasn't about winning the battle. It was about controlling the narrative, about forcing the Hegemony's pawns to dance to a human tune. The fighting was brutal, a desperate melee of claws and plasma, alien roars and human shouts. Toby fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, his scarred hands moving with lethal precision, every shot finding its mark. He saw Martin and David holding their ground, their faces grim but unyielding, a testament to the transformation humanity had undergone. Back at the colony, Candace worked feverishly. The communication array, a monstrous tangle of repurposed ship parts, medical scanners, and her own ingenious modifications hummed with barely contained energy. Sweat beaded on her brow as she bypassed the final layers of hegemony jamming, her green eyes glued to the flickering signal strength meter. The medic, now acting as her impromptu security, stood guard, a salvaged energy pistol clutched in their trembling hand. "How much longer, Candace?" "Almost there," she gritted out, her fingers flying across the console. "The Skarath interference is dropping. Toby's doing it." Outside, Toby's forces were slowly being pushed back, but they were retreating in an organized fashion, drawing the Skarath deeper into the jungle, away from the colony. The Skarath, confident in their numbers, pressed their advantage, their red eyes burning with renewed aggression. They believed they were finally crushing the human resistance. But they were wrong. With a triumphant cry, Candace slammed her hand down on the final activation switch. The array flared with blinding light, and a high-pitched whine filled the air, escalating beyond human hearing. A massive, focused burst of energy, amplified by the colony's power core, shot skyward, punching through the Hegemony's jamming network. "Signal sent," Candace yelled, collapsing back in her chair, utterly drained but exhilarated. "It's out there! To New Geneva, to every human colony in range!" The signal, a compressed data burst containing the decoded Hegemony intercepts, the logs of their experimental scenarios, and a desperate plea for aid and coordination, raced through the interstellar void. It was a message of defiance, a spark of rebellion ignited in the heart of a test subject. On the battlefield, Toby felt a sudden, almost imperceptible shift in the Skarath's behavior. Their coordinated attacks faltered, their movements becoming less fluid. He saw some of them pause, their heads tilting, as if listening to a distant, unheard command. The Hegemony was reacting. They were scrambling. "Pull back!" Toby roared, seizing the opportunity. "Fall back to the colony! We've done our part!" The retreat was orderly, a testament to the discipline forged in desperation. The Skarath, now receiving frantic, conflicting orders from their unseen masters, were too disorganized to mount an effective pursuit. They had been tested, and in their moment of perceived victory, they had been outmaneuvered. Back within the reinforced walls of the colony, the colonists collapsed, exhausted but triumphant. The fighting had been fierce, and many bore new scars, but they were alive. And more importantly, They had struck a blow against their unseen oppressors. The captured Skarath, still in its cell, watched the returning humans with an unreadable expression. Its red eyes, usually burning with contempt, now held a glint of something akin to respect. The message it was sent, it rasped, its voice devoid of its usual mocking tone. Toby, leaning against the cell wall, nodded, his breath ragged. It was. The hegemony knows we know. They will not be pleased, the Skarath said, a low rumble in its chest. They will send more, stronger. Let them, Toby replied, his crooked grin returning, sharp and dangerous, because now they're not just fighting a single colony, they're fighting an idea of what humanity truly is. Days turned into weeks. The Skarath attacks ceased entirely. The jungle, once alive with their menacing presence, became eerily quiet. The colonists knew it was the calm before the storm, but it was a calm they used to prepare. Candace worked tirelessly, refining her communication array, establishing intermittent contact with other human colonies, sharing the truth of the hegemony's experiments. New Geneva, true to the intercepted logs, was a beacon of hope. They confirmed the hegemony's tactics, shared their own experiences, and began coordinating a wider human response. The isolated sparks of humanity scattered across the galaxy were finally connecting, forming a nascent network of defiance. The Hegemony Council, far away in their pristine, unthreatened systems, watched with growing alarm. Their containment protocols had failed. Their test subjects were not only adapting, but actively challenging their authority. The species they had sought to control, to keep as a manageable threat, was now becoming an unpredictable force. The Skarath prisoner still held in the colony became an unexpected bridge. It had been observing, learning, and in its own alien way, seemed to be re-evaluating its understanding of the galaxy. During one of Toby's visits, it spoke, not with contempt, but with a strange, almost philosophical air. Your species, you are like a virus, it said. You adapt to every defense. You turn every weakness into a strength. You are inevitable. Toby looked at the creature, then out at the burgeoning defenses of the colony, at the faces of his people, no longer cowering but standing tall. No, he corrected, we're not a virus, we're evolution, and we're coming for you. The final, decisive battle for the colony never came. Instead, a massive, unfamiliar fleet, bearing the markings of New Geneva and several other now connected human worlds, appeared in orbit. They didn't come to conquer, but to liberate. The Skarath, caught between the wrath of their former masters and the rising tide of human defiance, scattered. Some retreated, others were captured, and a few surprisingly sought refuge with the humans they had once hunted. The Hegemony Council, faced with a unified human front and the undeniable evidence of their manipulative experiments broadcast across the local sector, was forced to retreat, their carefully constructed facade of benevolent oversight shattered. Their fear of humanity, once a quiet undercurrent, became a screaming reality. Toby, standing on the newly expanded perimeter wall, watched the human fleet depart, carrying with them the promise of a future where humanity was no longer prey. Candace stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" she murmured, her green eyes reflecting the distant stars. "Always," Toby replied, his crooked grin wide and genuine, "but now we hunt on our own terms." The medic, now with a spring in their step that belied their age, joined them. "What will happen to the Skarath prisoner?" Toby looked back at the colony, at the small makeshift cell. "It's no longer a prisoner. It's a witness, and maybe, just maybe, an ally." The Skarath had shown a capacity for learning, for re-evaluation. Perhaps in time they could be more than just tools. Humanity had faced its greatest test, not against a monstrous alien predator, but against a manipulative, unseen power that sought to control its destiny. And in doing so, they had not only survived, but had awakened to their true nature. They were not just survivors, they were conquerors of fear, architects of their own fate. The galaxy, vast and mysterious, now lay open before them, not as a hunting ground for others, but as a new frontier for humanity to explore, to thrive, and to perhaps become the very thing the hegemony had feared, the apex. The hunt indeed had truly begun, but this time humanity was leading the pack.